It started out with an idea to make a documentary.
Now, with over 60 interviews completed and more to record, it's time to listen fully.
These are the stories from those who experienced the Young Religious Unitarian Universalist program.
Hello, and welcome to our first YRUU podcast. My name is Lindsay Cattle-LaPointe.
And I am Dawn McKechnie.
And I'm Naomi Cooker.
We are the team of folks who have created this project that, as our introduction mentioned, started out as making a documentary and then quickly became a larger project that involved publishing a Mugbook and now producing a podcast.
As a person who did not grow up in the UU faith, but rather as a PK, that's preacher's kid in the Methodist tradition, I have a question. What's a Mugbook?
Oh, it's like a yearbook that youth would put together during the conference and then run to Kinko's to make copies for all the youth to take home. Our Mugbook was designed by Dawn and has 5 fully transcribed interviews, archived articles, curriculum of how to watch the film, and behind-the-scenes timeline of our work so far.
And the documentary, YRUU, is available for folks to watch now by renting or buying it through Vimeo. A link is available in our show notes. You can still enjoy these interviews in the podcast on their own without having seen the film, but watching it does give you an overall introduction to the Young Religious Unitarian Universalist program, and it's a pretty cool flick.
Both Lindsay and I went through this program as youth in the late 1990s. We wanted to capture the stories from this program that many people told us saved their lives.
This is going to become more clear the more you hear from multiple voices, from different generations and places. Some of these folks we featured in the documentary, while others we felt saving the stories for the podcast would be more impactful. Additionally, we have brand new recordings that we are doing, and we'll include a few of them in this season. For this episode, we are starting our first podcast with the first interview we recorded, Julie Ann Silberman-Bunn.
Lindsay and I drove to Springfield, Mass. On a beautiful, as I recall, very snowy day and met Julianne.
Julianne has really been the glue to this whole project as she herself produced a documentary called We All Benefit about YRUU and the youth office in Boston, Massachusetts. She helped lead us to so many folks you will hear on this podcast.
But before we start, we invite you to ground yourself and think of someone who helped you become who you are today. I invite you to draw their initials into the air. Now draw their initials onto your heart and keep them close as you listen in.
I had the really good fortune to come into a group that was already strong. And I think probably one of my strongest memories is being at that juxtaposition where the people who had been the strong leaders were graduating and the new crew wasn't quite ready to take leadership. And I was very shy and timid, and I took on the role of being the program coordinator for our local LRY group because it gave me a role which has proven to be a shaping thing throughout my involvement. So I went from being a super shy kid to being a really engaged leader because having a role meant I didn't have to just be present. And I didn't have to deal with the shyness stuff because I had a job. I had a job to do. I needed to do my job. I could always do that. And so being able to step into that kind of leadership at a really fairly young age, probably 14, was really helpful for me. But it also was just the peer group in my local group drew from many high schools in our area. And so kids who might be jocks in their high school and kids who were the hippie freaks and kids who were really academic all came to LRY, and we were just pals. Whereas had we been in the same high schools, we probably would never have even talked to each other. And yet we built really close friendships and bonds in that environment. And so having those friends shaped so much of me because it let me see people I didn't relate to in my own public school in different ways. And it gave me a source of friendship that I didn't have in the public school. I had a very tiny group in my public school, but in LRY, there weren't boundaries to who you could be friends with. And that really made a huge difference in my life. I was the vice president of our local, which meant I was responsible for making sure there was something going on at every session. We met Sunday evenings at 7:30, and so we had to have either a program or an activity, and we tried to balance it between really social things and bringing in speakers, and then I was responsible for planning like campouts and whether we were going to go to a conference that was happening regionally and how to coordinate who was going. And I knew I was at a point in my life where I didn't have a social group and I didn't have strong friendships. And it was at that point, I can pinpoint the date, it was 1979. And it was a point at which the LRY had become more important to me. And I was going to conferences almost every weekend at some church somewhere on the eastern seaboard, from Washington, D.C. to the Boston, Vermont area. And in April of 1979, the UUA board voted to accept the SCOIP report, which was the Special Committee on Youth Programs report, which was a committee to look at youth programs within Unitarian Universalism. And there were two reports submitted. One was the majority report and one was the minority report. And the minority report suggested that all funding be withdrawn from LRY and youth programming. And the UUA board chose to go with the minority report as opposed to the majority report, which recommended funding at a lower level. As a result, the LRY executives put out a call for youth to show up at the General Assembly in East Lansing, Michigan in 1979 to try and change the culture of what the UUA board was trying to create. And so at that General Assembly, the Youth Caucus did tremendous work in turning that decision around and getting the body of the General Assembly to vote to keep youth programming and to continue to fund youth programming. Now, Wayne Arneson stepped in at that General Assembly and said, what about if there was an adult working alongside the youth in the LRY office? And that was the turning point. That was what allowed the UUA board and the UU General Assembly to accept this plan to keep LRY in its current formation, but some of the funding would go to having an adult on board to meet the needs of youth who were not LRYers. And so that really started the whole next phase of this. But what happened for me was I went to that General Assembly in 1979. I learned about advocacy and leadership and the General Assembly and the UUA board, and my world blossomed into a place where I could take on a role as a leader. And I made friends across the continent, and some of those friends remain among my closest friends to this day. And they were the people who literally saved my life by taking me from, a small UU congregation into a world of Unitarian Universalism. And those friendships were people I could talk to, people who understood me, who knew what it meant to have Unitarian Universalist values just woven into your core. And to know that there were people like me in the world, not like the preppies in my high school, who cared about social justice and things beyond, was life-saving. It literally was life-saving. And so I know, I wouldn't be the person I am today if it hadn't been for all of that. But I probably wouldn't have survived my teenage years because I felt so alone. I was depressed. I was alienated. I didn't have a core group. And then all of a sudden, magically, I had a peer group that supported me all the time. And it was just an amazing, amazing turn of events for me. And it seems crazy looking back on it that this thing that was so frightening and terrifying as the dissolution of LRY formed as a catalyst to spear me into leadership in UUism and a career as a professional UU minister. I was 16. I was 16 in 1979. So I had just turned 16. So one of the things about the town that I was living in at that point in my life is that Lawrenceville is known for a prep school, and even in the public schools there's a lot of aspiration to that kind of preppiness, and it's just outside of Princeton, and a lot of people had aspirations in that direction. And I had parents who were radical. The joke in my family has always been that I'm the most conservative member of the family, and if anybody knows me at all, they know I'm not conservative at all. So that kind of tells you my parents were, social justice advocates in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And so I came into my teenage years with a belief in radical social action. My very first social justice action was when I was 2. And my father, who was very involved in civil rights, took me and he and his good friend, who was an African-American man, and his daughter, who was a week older than me, so we were both 2, went knocking door to door in the city of Trenton to talk about race relationships. And this was 1965. So a very relevant issue at the time, but that was the formation of my life. And through my UU congregation, social justice, it was normal in our Sunday school to bring in prisoners from the local, the Trenton State Prison, which is a maximum security prison, to talk to the Sunday school classes. That's how I was raised. And so to be in a public school system that was very much more normative and more mainstream and more upper crust and not activist was really difficult. Everybody else was wearing Izod polo shirts, and I was wearing tie-dye and batik, and I was the hippie girl. And I wanted to talk about ideas and the world and racial equality. And my friends in the school were very diverse, whereas the rest of my public school was very much divided along color lines. And when I went to LRY, those kind of social barriers disappeared. The cliques that you had in public school disappeared. And we were all just people. And it's going to sound silly in a lot of ways, but there's a game that was played both in LRY and YRUU which is called Wink. And Wink is this crazy wild game where you sit in a circle and you have a partner, and one person, originally when the game started, winked at pairs, and then the person in the front of the pair would try to get to them as quickly as they could, and the person in the back of the pair would try to restrain them and stop them from getting there. And it's a very physical game, which can turn rough and a little bit aggressive and violent at times. So it's not a super popular game among adults. But for youth, I think, who need to get out a lot of intensity and energy, it was a great game. But it also meant, because you're switching partners all the time in it, you weren't just with your person or your friend. So you became friendly with a wider group. And I think that's a lot of what LRY and YRUU do in general, is they break down those barriers and build opportunities for interacting with people whose experiences may be quite different from your own. And you learn to trust and build friendships, and to learn and be open and listen to people from different backgrounds, as opposed to saying, oh, they're other and outside of my circle. The boundaries of the circles start dropping, which was really beneficial for me. The transition from LRY to YRUU was a complex and fairly lengthy process. An important part of looking at why there needed to be change in the youth movement within Unitarian Universalism is the reality that things happened in individual congregations and at youth conferences from probably the early 60s through the late 70s. Unfortunately, what happens is youth culture changes fast. Every 4 years, people have come in and graduated from high school. The adult church doesn't move that quickly. And so they're still hearing about these things that happened in some church somewhere. What happened, and now we're putting together things that have happened in different churches on the West Coast, on the East Coast, down in the South, up in the North, wherever. And so they start amassing these stories, and the perception is lots of bad things are happening all at once. The reality is most of the kids who are currently in a youth program weren't even involved in the youth programs when some of those things occurred in other places. So, 8 years, those kids now are having their own kids. They've gone from 18 to 28. That's 10 years. But, that's a big gap. Whereas for adults in a church, 10 years is nothing. And, most of them are still at their jobs, still living their lives. And especially as they become older and they don't have children of their own, then those timelines really shrink for them, and they don't see the turnover that's occurring. And what happens is that all of that piles up. And yes, the culture of Unitarianism in our churches was lots of drinking. I mean, it was normative in most UU churches to have a new member wine and cheese party. So why are you expecting that your kids aren't going to drink wine? The expectations for youth were very different than the expectations for adults. And it was a time when the society changed. Thinking about that period of baby boomers from post-World War II into the early 70s, because those are the children of those, post-war years, that was one whole group. And then starting in the early 60s, you have this other group growing up who are these, they're now calling them the Joneses, because our continuum from 1963 into the early 70s were people who grew up in an age where we were trying to keep up with the Joneses. And that group, even though historically they fit in with the baby boomers, have nothing in common with most of the baby boomers. And so most of the problems that happened in LRY predated that last group of LRYers. Not that things weren't happening, because they were. And I think that's true anywhere. I mean, we know in the top boarding schools in the country, things happen. It doesn't just happen in youth group. If it's happening in youth group, it's because it's happening elsewhere in the kids' worlds. And so what was really going on was the adults were abdicating responsibility and not providing structure and not providing youth advisors. So the youth started, because they were required to have youth advisors, to find advisors on their own who might not be as in sync with the values of the older adults or the parents in the congregation. And so there was a little more challenge in keeping structures that church leaders were comfortable with. And youth were being youth. They were learning amazing things. They were leading beautiful conferences, bringing in great speakers, and learning skill sets. And yes, as there is in every group, there was a fringe group that was doing their own thing and maybe not participating as actively in the planned events and activities as some of the others. But the dissolution really was about fear of youth doing drugs, having sex, things that couldn't be controlled by the adults. And while that was happening, that wasn't the primary function of the youth program, and it wasn't what made the youth program so meaningful. And that was the piece that was lost. But as a result of all those fears and those things, individual congregations started banning LRY from existing in those churches, which left many of those churches with no youth program at all, or a youth program that was insular because it was only in its own congregation and had no connection to other youth groups in the region or in the continent. I was 16. I was a youth leader in the congregation in Princeton, New Jersey. And in order to have a conference at our church, we had to go before the board and get permission from the church board to hold the conference. So not having background or history, just being a youth going in, I went into the board meeting at my local church to ask if we could have a conference. And my minister at the time raised in that board meeting an experience he had had at the last youth conference we had had. And he began by saying, well, the last time you had a conference, I brought out-of-town guests to see the church building. And we walked in, and there was a young couple making babies on the couch in the church lounge. And here I am, this 16-year-old, and not knowing what to say or how to respond. And he went on to say, and there was an advisor less than 5 feet away, and it was one of our church advisors, and what will you do to make sure that doesn't happen ever again? So as a youth, I was kind of stunned and shocked, and I said, well, things happen, but we will do our best to prevent that from happening again. And we will, talk with our advisors and make sure, and we will be very public about that not being acceptable, and that we really focus on the community and not individual relationships. I know now, in retrospect, had I been that minister, I would have walked straight up to that advisor and said, look, we have an issue here. And the fact that that minister did not do that, and not only did he not do that, but he waited until the next board meeting, the next time a youth came into that board meeting to raise that, is absolutely what I'm talking about when I say the adults didn't want to take responsibility. And I truly believe that it is the responsibility of the adult leaders of the church to give youth really good, solid boundaries and to maintain those boundaries so that the youth can be free and flexible and push at those boundaries. That's what youth are there for. That's what their job is as youth. But it's also to help us adults to own what is important. And so for me, that's a really important example in one congregation, but I know it was happening in other congregations and throughout the association as a whole. And rather than say, let's stop this here and now, as UUs do, we create blanket policy to cover all youth or change the program. And I've seen it in congregations where they change bylaws because somebody didn't do a good job as treasurer. That's not how you maintain a functional organization. You stop the behavior with the individuals, not by changing policy or changing the entire youth structure. I talked a little bit about the General Assembly in 1979 and the appointment of Wayne Arneson to the UUA as a youth programs director. And so part of what Wayne did was to create, with the Youth Adult Committee, which was the standing committee of the board at that time, a conference model, which was called Common Ground. Common Ground 1 happened in Northfield, Minnesota in 1981. And it was this funded piece of re-envisioning youth programs. And it was bringing three or four youth from each UUA district that existed at the time, at least one adult from each of those districts, to this conference to talk about what was needed. What wasn't working, what was working, and what could be in the future. And there were a couple of things that came out of that conversation. One being, yes, we need a youth program. But in addition, there were a group of religious educators who really wanted a junior high denominational program. And there were a lot of youth who were right on that cusp of aging out and being young adults who really wanted there to be an organization. And there had been in the past junior youth groups and college age programs that were very successful, but they had not existed for some time. And so coming out of Common Ground 1, there really was a push for meeting the needs of three, I will call, distinct age groups. But because the charge was to create a youth program, all three of those age brackets got incorporated into the original design for YRUU. So when YRUU was founded, it began on January 1st of 1983 It was to cover the ages of 12 to 22, which, as any reasonable human being knows, is not a functional age range, because what's going on in the life of a 12-year-old and what's going on in the life of a 22-year-old have very little in common. And so I ended up being chosen to be one of the youth in the youth office. And so in LRY, there had been 4 program directors who ran all of the youth program. In YRUU, there were 2 youth program specialists, is what they became known as, and an adult director of youth programs. When I was there, it was Wayne Arneson. When I started with Colin Bird. Colin and I were making a transition both institutionally and organizationally. And so within the UUA, the LRY offices had been in a basement, in a building behind the main UUA building. When YRUU started, the Office for Youth Programs moved into the Religious Education Department at the UUA. Our office was up on the floor with the president and the vice president of the UUA. So there was a lot of anxiety because UUA staff had heard about the wild LRY executives and how they would have interns and parties in their office when they were publishing their newsletter, which was called People Soup, and they expected some of that to transition into YRUU. So they were leery of having these youth people in their space, so to speak. So, we figured early on that we needed to dress very professionally and act very professionally and be part of the team of the Religious Education Department and be part of the UUA staff. And that really was a huge change. I think there had been times earlier in the history of LRY when the LRY executives were not as isolated, but in the 70s, they kept being pushed further and further off to the side. And so bringing the youth program back into the UUA space proper and the Religious Education Department really was a grounding that helped with respectability from the view of ministers and religious educators and parents. So it helped a lot. But it also put a burden on our shoulders because we were transitioning some youth, like myself, who had come up in the LRY program into this new organization, which had kept a lot of the key components of youth leadership, but added in more adult advisors, more structure, more balance between adults and youth in leadership and programming, and provided curricula, which had not really existed for a long time from the LRY office. The UUA was now writing curriculum. It was the point at which the LIFT, Life Issues for Teens curriculum, was developed by Wayne Arneson and Cheryl Markoff, and became Cheryl Markoff Powers. And Wayne and Cheryl I was included in writing some of those as part of my time in the youth office. But that was the first curriculum the UUA had released for youth groups in decades. And so it really was a sea change in how youth programming was being treated. We also started a new newspaper called Synapse out of that. And what happened was in LRY, when they were publishing People's Soup, they brought in all these youth because they needed to keep the costs low because the budget was so low. But when we moved to YRUU, we had the benefit of being within the UUA structure. And so Synapse was actually done through the UUA publishing office. So we had all kinds of resources at our disposal in design and publishing that LRY had not had. So it really changed. We didn't need to have those parties where everybody was folding the newsletters and putting on the labels, because they had corporate people and companies that they outsourced to that did all the labeling and all the folding. So it really, by putting funding into youth programming and adult support structures into youth programming, we were able to focus on the aspects of youth programming that were critical to youth, and also made the adults feel more comfortable because they had control of some of the technical aspects behind what was happening. In both organizations, it was formed about interactions and youth leadership and youth community. Without the community, all you would have had was some programs and spaces. And they're really honestly talking from the perspective of someone who not only made that transition from LRY into YRUU, but eventually became a YRUU advisor and then a minister who went and was an advisor at youth conferences and had youth groups in their church, and then eventually saw their own child as a leader in YRUU. What I can say is the essential core of friendship, community, trust, and youth leaders stayed, and I would place bets that they had stayed in LRY when the transition had happened from the two youth organizations, the one of the UU of the Unitarians and the one of the Universalists that formed LRY originally. And that common thread was getting to know your peers and building friendships in a relaxed environment. You know, we worshiped together, we created worship together that was deeply meaningful to us. It was not someone putting something upon us. It was not a preacher preaching down to us. It was our peers engaging us in worship, engaging us, all of us, in the creation of every aspect of the community. Whether we were at a camp where we were in gender segregated cabins, or whether we were in rooms at a church where we were all, body piling in sleeping bags, it really wasn't about what one or two people might do off on the side. It was really about the bonding of the larger group. It was about hearing from one another what we were worried about. What were our core values? What were our fears about the world we were growing of age into? And our frustrations with the adults, our frustrations with our parents, with our church leaders, with the church as an institution applying boundaries on our creativity and our vision for what we could provide. I always go back to the John Murray quote of give them not hell, but give them hope. And I think, sometimes that's all our youth have to give us is hope. They want to provide hope for our future. They want to take away that fear of hell. And our adults want a little bit of the fear of hell to keep us in line. And youth are like, we're done with that. Let's see what we can create. And I think that creativity, that visionary quality that our youth bring to their programs, sometimes it's a little overpowering, and it's what adults might call unrealistic. And they want to know how to apply it. And the youth aren't concerned about how we make it happen. They just want to make it happen. And unfortunately, I think, one of the challenges historically for institutional Unitarian Universalism is that we disenfranchise those youth because we try to stomp out that vision and that hope. And so while they continue to consider themselves Unitarian Universalists, they're not in our congregations bringing us that hope still. And we have all these new people in our congregations who are just learning about Unitarian Universalism. And we need to make more opportunities for vision and hope, both in our worship style and in our programming.
We will return after this message.
Working on YRUU made one thing clear to me. Being in community is how we not only survive, but how we thrive as humans. The Young Religious Unitarian Universalist program is an example of why belonging is so fundamental to building community. Your support keeps our important conversation about the work out there and going. Please go to yruu.org/donate to give what you can. And thank you so much.
The empowerment of community and vision is really about youth leadership. And in LRY, it had been kind of a free-for-all, and it was just left to the youth to do on their own. Within YRUU, there was more adult support, not necessarily adult leadership, but adults putting some checks and balances on. And even as an adult leader myself, I remember saying, well, that's a really great idea, but what has to happen to allow that to work? And what would the church have to provide for you to allow this event to take place? So the adults were providing stronger supervision and, yes, honoring the rules, which was really helpful in a lot of ways because it took being the heavy away from your peers. Whereas in LRY, being the heavy, kicking people out because they disobeyed the rules, fell solely to your peers. In YRUU, it fell to your peers with the support from the adults of the organization. So you felt that it was more of a collaborative effort. And I think that was part of the benefit that YRUU had, was that it really was entrenched, at least in its earlier years, in the life of the congregations and the life of the districts and the life of the UUA. It was part of that with the support structures that offered. We did have to honor the insurance policies and stick to the letter of the law in certain things, but we had that to fall back on as well. So it was really, really beneficial to be part of the organization and to have that not control by adults, but support from adults, which had not existed in LRY in the years that I was involved in it at the end. So what do we have for our youth now? And that's a really challenging question for me. I have talked to UU ministers who say, oh, we've got this great stuff, it's all online. People on the West Coast are bathing in it and they're getting all the same benefits we got at other points from LRY and YRUU. And what I will say to that is the West Coast has always had a strong infrastructure at the regional level and the local level and the district level that supported ongoing youth program. Most of the other regions in our country don't have that. And when the continental structure was removed and the recommendation was that youth programming be done regionally, most of those regions, with the exception of the West Coast, lost all connectivity to the UUA and to wider UU programming. And I understand that some of the changes had to do with safety. They had to do with insurance. Because we have a changing society that is more litigious and more concerned about certain issues, about youth and adults being alone in spaces together, which is absolutely understandable, and I wouldn't, suggest otherwise. But, I came of age in a time when it was not uncommon to have 4 youth in a hotel room at General Assembly. At the end of my son's time in YRUU, the requirement was that a youth be in the same housing, preferably the same room, with their sponsor for General Assembly. Well, if my son's sponsor at General Assembly was the 75-year-old social justice matriarch of the congregation, I didn't want him sharing a room with her, and she didn't want to share a room with him. And I don't blame either of them. So losing some of the collaborative of youth housing and trying to absorb them into the wider structure actually took away some of the community and the bonding that had happened. It did bring some things back. Going back, way, way back, my first General Assembly in 1979 took place on a college campus. And one of the things that we did have in that environment was that we all ate in the cafeteria. And so you really did interact with leaders of the UUA, adult leaders that you never would have come in contact with otherwise. But they were in front of you in the line at the cafeteria, and they got a table and there were 2 extra spaces. And so they called you to sit with them. And I know for me as a 16-year-old, that's how I met Denny and Jerry Davidoff, who turned out to be huge pillars of Unitarian Universalism and leadership, and Denny went on to be moderator of the UUA, and they became close friends. And Denny preached at my installation at the last church I was called to, but it was because there were casual places instead of in later years when we're all in hotels and in a convention center and we're rushing off with a friend to find a meal at a local restaurant, including more of those opportunities. And that was what you found in youth programming, and why in youth stuff, in a conference, in a church, where you're all grabbing your meal and sitting at communal tables, there's a lot more interaction. And that's something that we don't have in a lot of the adult UU spaces of now. I mean, there's the people for whom YRUU or Star Island or Ferry Beach or Debenhamill Pines or Elliott up on the Pacific Northwest, Seabeck, there's all these UU places that have, meaning Susie is another one that I think of. And the reality is, it doesn't matter whether you're UU, you're a Girl Scout, a Boy Scout, you go to a Jewish youth organization or a Catholic youth organization. It's the intensity of what you pack into a small amount of safe time. And I've been to many of those camps and many retreats and conferences, and I love them all. And each one holds a special place in my heart. But so did my Girl Scout camp. And so what I know is that it's not just the place. The place has certain qualities. I mean, certainly something like the chapel at Star Island is a deeply meaningful place because we all process from the porch with our candlelit lanterns up to the dark chapel and the chapel lights. But it's really about having created a place where community takes that line and stays in line. And those are some of the boundaries that we do create, that there is this beautiful pattern to how we interact. And that there are leaders who say, yeah, this is what we do, and this is how we do it. And no, we're not going to be in a circle and have the circle try to, as an amoeba walk to a chapel. We're going to walk in this line, and it's going to be okay. And when we're going to get to that chapel, no, we're not going to preach at you. But hey, even if we did preach, that'd be okay. Because there are conferences at Star Island where people do preach in that chapel. And it's the fact that we're present together with a structure, and that we allow people to lead, and that we allow our leaders to come from the group. Because usually in both LRY and YRUU, but even in Unitarian Universalist congregations and in our denominational leadership, these people come up out of our smaller groups. They come from our local youth group to our regional youth group to the denominational youth leadership. We move together as a cohort. And being able to do that is part of what allows us to function within the democratic process, is that at the core, we are trusting the process and trusting the people we have chosen, or that the ones who have walked before us have chosen to be our leaders. And we allow them to do the leading. And when it's our turn to lead, we step up. And when our time to lead is done, we step back into the wider group and we help others to follow those who are now the leaders. And I know for me, going from being a youth leader to being an adult supporter and ally of youth programs, that was a big thing for me. I needed to let the youth lead. I needed to be there in a very different capacity. I needed to encourage, I needed to offer tools for leadership, but I didn't need to do the leading. And I needed to be able to empower youth who might not have ever seen themselves, as I certainly didn't, as a 14-year-old, ever see myself as a leader or eventually becoming a UUA committee person or a minister. And I never would have gotten there if other people hadn't trusted me with that leadership. And I've been very blessed over the years with mentors and leaders, of ministers and friends who encouraged me and said, "You've got the skills, do it." You know, when I thought, oh, somebody who knows what they're doing has to do this. No, you can learn. We have to trust our youth, trust them to learn. This is a place where they can learn and build skills and be the hope that we want and be our future leaders as adults if we can keep them networked in to our wider society. But we've got to keep providing opportunities as they age out of youth programming into young adult, into career people, into professionals and parents. There've got to be all kinds of new communities and opportunities at every stage. Youth culture talks about move in, move back. And it used to be step up, step back. And as we've tried to bring in more inclusive language, it's move in and move out. Making room for others is a lesson that I've had to take to heart. I'm really fortunate to have attended a Quaker theological school, which really taught me the importance of silence and pause. And in Quaker community, there's silent worship, and there are often pauses between speakers. And Quakers can often tell when UUs come to join them because the UUs are popping up one after another, and they call it popcorn worship. And because UUs don't have a true comfort with silence. And I think that's true of our leadership. If there's a void, somebody wants to fill it. And that doesn't make time or space for the shyer, more introverted person to process and to bring themselves forward as a potential leader, or for someone else to suggest them and encourage them. And that is something that I have really had to reflect on. That I took leadership because I was encouraged and I was invited. And I see a lot of my responsibility as an adult, as a UU leader, as making space and lifting up the next generation or next generations of potential leaders. Because every generation views our faith through the same lens, but it may be adjusted a little differently. And that adjustment is what helps us to continue to be what Unitarian Universalism is, which is a living faith. We don't want to be stuck. You know, we are not the people fighting the Calvinists in the 1600s. Our faith isn't there. We're not the early Unitarians who were fighting with the Baptists fighting with the Universalists for separation of church and state. You know, we're not the Unitarians who were fighting for church and state to stay together because it benefited us. We are believers in an ever-evolving faith, a living faith. And if we're going to believe that our theology can change and grow, we have to empower our people to change and grow, and our leadership to change and grow. And, you know, as a minister, probably, I say this all the time, one of the greatest gifts in my first ministry was the couple who had been members of the congregation for over 50 years. Because when all the 20-year members, 10-year members would say, oh, but we can't do it that way, we've always done it this way, this elderly couple would say, well, yeah, we've done it that way for about 15 years. But before that, and before that, and, you know, that's what we need. And, you know, sometimes it's the new people, it's the children who can tell us what those new possibilities are. And we've got to get out of our own way and let them lead. And give them support in doing that. I mean, sure, maybe some of their ideas won't succeed, but some of them will. And no matter who we are, some of our ideas won't succeed, and some will. So why not take the risk and empower our youth to be leaders? It's only going to be creative, interesting, and take us on a new journey.
Hi everyone, it's Lindsay. I wanted to jump in here to tell you that we are having a con-inspired connective retreat November 20th to the 22nd on Cape Cod in Massachusetts. This is co-directed by myself and Reverend Jason Leiden with our weekend musician Matt Meyer. Many of the people you will hear on this podcast plan to be in attendance and even help lead some of the activities. You too could be a leader. We are looking for you to submit your ideas now by April 17th. When you head to our website, YRUU.org, click on Connective Retreat. It's time to connect. See you there.
One of the places leadership takes place that we least expect it is dishwashing. And it's, you know, one of my dear friends is someone I met literally when I was 14, and we were in the kitchen doing dishes. And he and I went on to run many conferences together because we developed relationship. We developed trust. We got to know each other. And then from there, he was able to say, hey, I'm going to be doing this conference. Would you be willing to come in? You have really practical skills. I need someone to mail out the registrations and receive the registrations. So can you be our registrar? Well, yeah, I can do that. I can make lists. I know how to do that. You know, and from that, I ended up, you know, keeping track and then doing the conference mailing lists, and then I started doing more publications. And well, since everybody knew me because I was the one they registered with, it was easy for me to coordinate rides for people because I knew where everybody was coming from and I could hook people together. And so for me, a lot of my leadership skills come from networking. And that networking was something that I learned as a youth. And gradually over time, doing it in my little youth group, doing it in youth conferences held at my church, well, then I got on the board in my church, and then I got on the board in the regional youth organization. Well, then the UUA was looking for a youth to be on some UUA committees, and I was a youth, so I could do that. And so, you know, it just was a gradual process. I didn't take on being on a UUA committee without doing the local little tasks. And I needed to do that. I needed to go from, you know, washing dishes to making dishes to doing the shopping. You know, there's all kinds of little jobs. There's never enough people to do the smaller jobs, the less glitzy jobs, you know, and they're not jobs that are based on charisma usually. And I found that there were always leaders who led through simply their charisma, but oftentimes they didn't have the skills, and they had to learn the skills later. I have two ministerial colleagues in particular who I first met when we were 14. And we joke about it because they were musical and charismatic and dynamic and outgoing, and that's what brought them to people. I didn't have that as an introvert. I had to learn the skills and build relationship one person at a time. And having done that, then I had that network to fall back on, whereas they had to learn those skills after the fact. So why not teach skills young? And there's some really wonderful studies being done about cultures other than our Western culture, which teaches kids to do things much later in life. In most cultures, as soon as a kid can sweep, they're given a broom. As soon as they can stir a pot, they're given a spoon. We need to do that with our youth. We need to help them to do the little learning so that they can grow into skilled leaders. Nobody wants to be thrown off the diving board into the deep end. But when you take my hand and you walk me into the water and you teach me to swim all the way through the process, or you give me some buoyancy device to keep me going, I'm going to be great. And that's what I think LRY and YRUU both provided, was that network of friends and peers and just other youth and adult leaders who could hold us up and let us, start to slip under and then bring out that flotation device and help us keep going. They brought us the tools. My kids tease me to this day that wherever I go, I have a connection. And it's only because of Unitarian Universalism and my involvement in youth programming that I have that network of people that I can call on. I don't always have to call on them because they gave me a lot of skills, but when I need them, they're there. And that is the most important and life-saving thing I could ever imagine. One of the challenges and one of the reasons that YRUU programming ceased to exist was a turn to very specific anti-racism, anti-white supremacy culture programming. And not that I think that is problematic. I think, of course, yes, we don't want racism and we don't want white supremacy in our UUism, but the reality is that we have come historically from a predominantly white movement. And we can't stop our history. There's always that quote, those who forget their history are doomed to repeat it. And one of the things that we are blocking out with that history is the number of children of color who have been raised in our youth programs because children of color were adopted into liberal, white, Unitarian, Universalist families and did not find a place for themselves once they left the youth program. They had a home in youth programming. They were comfortable in youth programming. They were with peers, chronological peers, people who were willing to embrace cultural exploration with them, which didn't always happen in the wider church community. And so I think, not only do I not think that our youth programming, YRUU, was a white supremacist organization, I think that it was a place that was open to challenging those cultures. What it wasn't open to was dropping the parts of community building trust, safety in favor of programming from an external source that looked at anti-racism work and white supremacy work as something other than who they were. As a lifelong Unitarian Universalist, these values of inclusion and diversity are bred into us. You know, I remember when I got to be an adult, and for the first time I was outside of my own community, which was diverse, being shocked because my UU friends were anti-racist. They weren't about white, and they got it. You know, they understood what it meant to grow up in multicultural inner city settings. And then all of a sudden, the institution of the UUA decided that this needed to be the focus. Well, yeah, it's a great focus, but you want us to start back at square one, and we're at stage 15. And we want to start from here, and we don't want you to make us reinvent the wheel. Let us go from here. Let us move. And I think that is one of the deeply problematic things in Unitarian Universalism. It's one of the reasons why so many of our children and youth don't stay with us, is that we teach them these values as children, and they've internalized them, and they want to be living them as adults. And our adult congregations are still teaching those same things over again, and there isn't room for them to keep going, to deepen their spirituality, to deepen the experience and the expression of that liberal faith, because we focus so much on the people coming into our faith, we forget to create opportunities for those who have been raised here to explore more deeply and to go more broadly. And I think that's really problematic. And what happens is then the only place for us lifelong UUs is either move out or be a leader. And there are people like me who have chosen to live a life as a minister or a religious educator, and that's a great use of our skills and our resources, but it's not the only use. And it's something that we as Unitarian Universalists have failed consistently to do, is to have an across-the-board deepening program where people get theological and historical understand the spirituality of Unitarian Universalism without having to go to seminary, to be a deeply committed spiritual leader within our community, but not be the minister, not be the professional leader. Every other faith tradition, I mean, literally every Protestant faith tradition keeps 60% of their youth. We keep 10. We're doing something wrong. We've got to figure out what that is if we have any hope of long-term survival. We have horrible institutional memory, period. And part of the reason we don't have institutional memory is we don't keep our youth. And without youth and young adults moving into the roles of adult advisors and adult leaders within the wider Unitarian Universalist Association, we don't have that memory anywhere, and we didn't document it well. And we failed to document it well, which is one of the reasons having a documentary about it is such a wonderful idea. We really need to have a media where people can quickly and easily access some of that history. Reading it in books once upon a time was great, but most people don't have time, and they're not in a hardbound book paper world. They're in a digital world. And so getting things to people in video format is part of the education. And I think, as a religious movement, we would well be served, rather than saying, oh, let's talk about history, to have some of our greatest scholars doing documentaries and videos about the cool things in our history and the damaging things in our history, so that we can learn about them. We can learn about things like what happened at the 1968 and 69 General Assemblies, when there were challenges from the Black Caucus to the way the white-dominated society. Now, I learned those as a teenager because I was doing social justice work. But most of the adults coming into Unitarian Universalism don't learn those at all. And if they do, it's way later in their journey through becoming a UU and a leader in our movement. And a lot of that is how we make information known. We put it in a book, and we put it in our church library, and we hope that somebody will read it someday. And, that's not going to cut it. And because we don't have a liturgical calendar as a movement, we don't go back to these. And if you have ministers who are not lifelong ministers, that's not part of what they're reflecting on, because that's not part of their experience and their knowledge. And a lot of our ministers come from outside of our faith tradition. Again, as an early career minister, I was ordained at 29, and I, at the time, was one of a very small group. In previous generations, there had been many more ministers who came in early in their careers, but there was a long period of disparagement for younger people, and a period in which most ministers were second or third career ministers. And so, of course, they're not bringing that UU youth experience with them. It's not current, it's not relevant. So there's a lot of that history that's lost. The name YRUU still exists with some youth groups in certain places, but institutionally, the financial support and the staffing for YRUU was withdrawn. And my understanding is it was withdrawn kind of across the board, in a way that was not entirely anticipated. That there was a review panel that was working very hard at examining other aspects of youth programming in other denominations and what was successful, and that they thought they were creating a report that was going to really provide a new direction for YRUU, and then they were told, nope, the funding has been withdrawn. And they were shocked. And my understanding, as I've talked to different groups of people through that period, is that there was a belief from administration that leadership of this would be better served at a lower level, that there was a belief that white supremacy culture meant that only elite few were able to participate, and that it wasn't a wise stewardship of financial resources to be funding something at a level that didn't engage the least of us or the stranger among us. And Intellectually, there's a piece of me that can understand why someone who didn't understand how YRUU really worked might believe that. And the reason I say that is that if you look at it from outside, you see a leadership structure that has individuals selected from their regions that come, and it's the same core group of people. But what you miss is that that core group of people had risen up through their program. They had been local leaders, regional leaders, denominational leaders, and that they were bringing that inspiration back into local congregations, into districts, in a way that having a regional group doesn't. There was a level of inspiration that was brought back, and a sense of what is possible that was brought back, that when people only go one step up, they don't have that vision of something bigger. I was specifically told by a UUA staff person when I asked about funding for youth programming, that when the youth asked for associational youth programming again, the UUA would consider funding it again. And my position has been, they're not going to ask for something they don't know is possible. And until we help them to see that, yeah, you could have something bigger. Yes, you could have conferences. And so what happened, to my understanding, was there was a ConCon, a continental conference, which brought individuals from all over the country, but it was somewhat white supremacy culture intertwined, is that you had to get there. It cost money to be there. And that was viewed as limiting it to a few people. So rather than coming up with an alternative funding process, the decision was made to eliminate it. And I think that was the wrong decision. I am a stepmother of 2 kids, one of whom was an active YRUUer, one of whom goes to Unitarian camps, but doesn't have any interest in Unitarian Universalism in churches. Both of my children have really been burned by Unitarian Universalism. My older son, by the dissolution of YRUU as a denominational organization. He was right on the cusp of denominational leadership at the time when ConCon was canceled, and he felt that his connection to this faith tradition was ripped away from him. My younger son has seen what churches do to eat up and spit out ministers and religious educators, and doesn't really have a lot of trust in those institutions. And while theologically, I think both of my children probably are Unitarian Universalists, they are not active in congregations, and I would be very surprised if my younger son ever has a connection to UUism other than through camps and conference centers. My older son, I think, could be one of those people who, when he has kids, will come back, because he does see a place for it, and he does like the community aspect. My husband became a religious educator and was very burned by a congregation, and watched me be burned by several congregations, and is very disenfranchised with Unitarian Universalism as an institution. My call to ministry was one of the first times in my life that I felt that spiritual, overwhelming power. And it was one of those times I was in the youth office. I was 21 years old, and I had been asked to come to New Orleans, Louisiana, to do a workshop, a series of workshops at a youth conference about YRUU, and also to meet with some of the adults in the church and from the region about this change from LRY to YRUU. And then I was asked to preach the Sunday service in that church that Sunday morning. And we had a good conference. It was a little strange weekend. It flooded. I was flying in, and so it was a little chaotic. The start of the conference, everybody arrived in chaos because the entire city was flooded. But the next morning it was fine. Those levee things work. They get the water out of the city. But what happened for me that weekend was I really began to see how I was a resource to the adult regional staff and a resource to advisors. But also, it was the first time that I had ever been in the pulpit aside from in my home church. And that Sunday morning, I stood in the pulpit and I literally felt as if this light had shined and told me that this was where I was going to be spending my life, that I was going to become a UU minister. And at the time, I was in college, I was an art major. Being a UU minister was like, it was something older people did. I wasn't an old person yet. I was 21. So the thought that that might become a first career for me was really pretty alien. And I remember getting back to the UUA on Monday morning, and I had my weekly meeting with Wayne Arneson, who was our supervisor. And I said to Wayne, what would you think about me becoming a UU minister? And Wayne started to crack up, and he was laughing. And my first thought was, oh my God, Wayne doesn't think I should do this. And then he stopped and he said, the rest of us have known since you were 16 that you were going to be a UU minister. It was just time you figured it out. And I have reminded Wayne of that on numerous occasions, but I think that's an important part of what happened in both LRY and YRUU was that, adults might see things, but they weren't going to tell you. They were going to help you to find it for yourself. And having to learn how to find out who I was and to create a life of pastoral care around helping other people to find who they are and what is of value to them is just the best career path I could ever imagine. And while I loved being a UU minister and serving congregations, and I did that for almost 25 years, and I still do as an assistant minister focused on pastoral care, but my primary role now is as a hospice chaplain. And so in my day-to-day life, I get to help people and families really see what their lives have meant and to give those final gifts to their family of what mattered. What do you value? What is the legacy that you want to leave for your family? What is at the core of who you are that you don't want to disappear? And the bottom line in almost every case is love. And I can't think of anything that I got more from my experience in LRY and YRUU than to know that I'm loved and to have people around me who can tell me, yeah, you're flawed, yeah, you're broken, but I love you anyway. And isn't that what every human needs? You know, we need to know that we're valuable to other people. I mean, we all want that. That's the damage our society does, is to tell people they're not loved and lovable. And YRUU and LRY, they unbroke that brokenness and helped people to heal. What more could we ask for from a youth program? So.
This podcast was produced by Linden Tree Productions. The interview was conducted by Naomi Cooker.
Music featured by Scott Murphy and Matt Meyer.
For more information, go to yruu.org. That's the question all spelled out. yruu.org.
Don't forget our documentary, YRUU, is available to watch now by renting or buying it through Vimeo.
Please subscribe and review the podcast. It'll help more folks find this content. Thanks.